Let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the award-winning podcast where we talk about gaining, feedism, and everything in their orbit. I'm James.
And I'm Tim, so let's get into it. Today we're welcoming to the show a good friend of ours. Today we've got Susan.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you, my love?
I'm doing pretty well. We're experiencing a false fall here in New York, so it's like a balmy 70 degrees, which is great.
Same here in Ohio.
I am ready for more suitable weather. You know, as a fat person, I do feel disadvantaged by the slender folk who love to go on and be like, I'm a summer body, I'm a summer bee. Like, great, Karen, fuck you. Like, I am not. I'm actively dying out here. I would like it to be a bit cooler, please. I would like a nice, cool breeze. I'd like autumnal colours and flavours. Except for that pumpkin spice bullshit. That's just like a really sad attempt at gingerbread. And like, I don't know what the fuss is about, just personally speaking.
A lot of cinnamon. A lot of people who love cinnamon, I suppose. I don't know.
Cinnamon and nutmeg, and pumpkin does have a distinct flavor. So, I mean, I like pumpkin spice. Thank you very much.
Well,
I go to Starbucks and get a pumpkin spice latte. I don't care how basic it is.
well, we're not talking about pumpkin spice lattes. Today, we're not talking about the oncome of cooler and more suitable weather. Today, we're actually taking things in a bit of a fun direction, because today we're getting a bit paganistic and we're talking about Imbolc, which I was not actually even aware of up until, Tim, you were sharing with me about, because you identify as pagan and you were telling
Yes.
me about the wheel,
The Sabbats. Yeah, there are 8 Sabbats in a year, and they're all, are basically our holidays. So beginning with, I suppose it begins on December 21st, Yule, and then it follows Imbolc, then Eostra, then Litha, Lunasa, Mabon, Samhain. I feel like I'm forgetting one. But yeah, there's 8 of them in the year, and Imbolc happens to be one of them.
And that's what we're talking about today, which is the day of Imbolc. And we're just going to be sharing some experiences, delving a little into things. So, Susan, are you ready to get into it today?
Always, yes.
Fabulous. Well, listen, first cab off the rank, and, I will put this to the pair of you. What can you tell us about the history of Imbolc, which is not a muscle gainer's wet dream?
No. I mean, it's an ancient Celtic festival. Most of the Sabbats in modern paganism are modeled on the Celtic tradition, because a lot of them carried over into the modern world and were adopted by the Roman Catholic Church as it was spreading. So initially, Imbolc is kind of like the period in between winter and spring. And it's supposed to be a time of like you begin to prepare for the earth waking up again. And it's a festival of light, color, bonfire. Well, not necessarily bonfires, but more like hearth fires. It's more of a home-centered holiday. It's a lot of kind of like, when people say spring cleaning, that's kind of where that tradition comes from. And it's meant specifically to honor the goddess Brigid, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, because in Gaelic, I think it's pronounced a little bit differently, but that deity was eventually adopted by the Catholic Church and turned into Saint Bridget, and it is still celebrated as Saint Bridget's Day.
Yes, the Catholic Church is pretty good with that. I think
Yeah.
it was called syncretism.
Syncretic, yeah. They did the same thing with so voodoo or Vodun, or however it's supposed to be pronounced in Haiti, is a syncretic religion. It was mixing West African tradition and their religious practices with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, Santeria is like that too. The Catholic Church, and I feel like the Catholic Church learned that from probably the Greeks, because they were the first people between like Grecian and Egyptian gods had a lot of syncretism back in the day.
Yeah,
Like,
they do.
Most of my like knowledge, I suppose, of pagan morphology comes from like a Hellenistic background.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's
I,
the one that survived the longest. I mean,
yeah,
you mentioned Zeus, and people know who you're talking about, or Hercules, or Hera, or any of these gods that have carried over into modern society, and symbols that are still being used. Like the symbol for medicine, you see it on the side of every ambulance. Is Hermes? It's his caduceus. It's the wand that he carried. It became the international symbol of medicine.
which is
So
really actually kind of interesting because it's supposed to be like the rod of Asclepius or whatever, and then it sort of
yeah,
transformed over the years into I call it catechist. Please excuse me for not being able to pronounce words correctly. I've only ever read them, so however I thought they were pronounced is how I'm going to say them. I don't want to go into the comments and see people being like, it's actually pronounced whatever.
you're not wrong though. They still sometimes use the staff of Asclepius, but they don't. It's kind of become interchangeable. Sometimes you see if it's a single staff with a snake coiled around it,
Yeah.
that's Asclepius. If it is the wand with wings and the two serpents coiled around it, that's the caduceus.
Hmm.
I was doing some research on Imbolc before because obviously there are ones I've heard of, like Samhain is, Halloween, and Yule is Christmas. Like there are some obvious and clear-cut ones, or Eostra is Easter. But Imbolc was one I wasn't too familiar with, and when I was looking up some of the, like, I guess, tropes of like what are we talking about with this festival, there was one I saw about like in Wicca, I believe it's the time of, I think it's Cernunnos, the great horn god. I think it's where he's being retrieved from the underworld and being nursed back to health by the goddess Rhiannon. So I don't know,
Yeah.
it definitely gets that vibe of like not like the height of spring, but like that first melt. Is that what you kind of call it? Like when the frost first begins to melt and you first really begin to see like the emergence of life again, and it's, yeah, like that preparation. And it's ironic you talk about spring cleaning because I like to ditch my shit in bulk. Uh, during a spring cleaning, I am very liberal with what gets the chop. So listen, I'm absolutely here for the festival. Absolutely here for all that. Um, but what do people do in form of celebration? Like, I think we can assume that there's some form of, you'd mentioned hearth-related fires, and there's some kind of like eating, feasting, celebratory meals and bits and pieces. But what else might you do to celebrate in bulk?
Well, in terms of the actual like Celtic tradition, I am not certain because I don't know anyone from Ireland and I don't know if they still practice it, the way that they did in the ancient times. I think a lot of it was, I think that there was a certain emphasis on sewing because the wool had already been collected from the previous fall. And so this is when a lot of spinning and sewing was done. And rope making, I think, was also another thing that was done around this time of the year. It's basically anything to get you ready for the year ahead. And in modern tradition, not entirely familiar either, because I don't think that this is the more popular Sabbath for current pagans to celebrate. This is, I think most people take it as a day of sort of remembrance, kind of a day of like, what has the last year brought me? What am I looking forward to the next year? It's funny. You'd think that you do this around New Year's Eve, right? But Imbolc falls closer to Groundhog Day than it does any other holiday, right? So I have to admit that I'm a little foggy on how modern pagans are celebrating it.
Up until you all brought this to my attention, I wasn't really familiar with Imbolc. I was more Beltane, is it? That's the one that's in
Yeah,
summer, I believe, right?
May 1st. It's the kickoff to the what am I trying to say here? The
Summer
living
solstice.
season of the earth, like when everything is alive and like everything's green and it's warm and like Beltane is sort of the kickoff to all that.
Yeah, so Imbolc would be like the predecessor of it. It's like
Yes.
the reawakening,
Yeah.
Persephone coming up from the underworld type stuff.
Well, and even before Beltane, you have Eostra, which is the actual like big spring festival.
Yeah.
That's Easter as we've
Mhm.
come to know it now.
Probably Ireland's big on like sacred wells and springs. So there's probably like pilgrimages happening during that time, right? I would assume. I mean,
I
again,
would think so because there are some myths associated with Imbolc about wishing wells
mm,
and sacred springs and things like that. So yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right.
Yeah, I feel I feel like it's always something with like a spring or whatever. I know that the Catholic Church went on like a pretty big campaign of sanctifying Celtic places of worship and like bringing them within the religion when that was happening. And I feel like some of my other pagan friends who are a little bit more mindful of Celtic tradition have mentioned things like this in the past to me. There's like pilgrimages. I think they like tie pieces of cloth to trees near a sacred spring or a well to kind of set an intention for the year. Usually I feel
Hmm.
like it's a lot to do with like health.
That makes
With
sense because that puts me in mind of have you ever heard of a mummers parade?
a mummers parade, no. What
It's a type of tradition where like and it has different interpretations depending on what culture you're talking about. Like in Greece it's more satirical, but I think in the Celtic tradition it was a rambling troupe of people who would go from village to village singing and dancing, and they would tie ribbons to oak trees, and in a sense like telling the earth we're here, we're awake, we're alive. They carry a bit, giant garland of flowers. And so that makes sense to me that you mentioned the tying ribbon part.
Yeah, I feel like it was like from what I can recall, like strips of their loved ones' clothing to kind of like give them a blessing of health in the upcoming year, like that sort of a situation. And then, like likely bathing in like sacred spring water or like cleaning things. It's always something like that, usually in that time of year across different sort of like esoteric belief systems. It's usually like a preparation.
Something that stands out to me, listening to you guys talking about this is, and as the non-pagan in the room, it's so interesting how you can say these things like, oh, springs and wells and the tying of ribbons to trees, and there's, the little part of the brain that goes, oh, how fun. Little traditions that people used to do. But then it's like, well, actually, the idea of like a well giving life is not actually foreign to me because of the concept of the fountain of youth, or even just the simple notion of a wishing well. Like, I am constantly being reminded with, paganistic and Wiccan stuff that actually this call back to a very tied to the earth, eternal way of seeing the universe is really, in some regards, not that far off of what we just understand as tropes in our own mind today. And I often wonder about things like, you're a kid, wishing wells, throw in a coin, how cute. But there is a little part of me, and I've spoken about this before, when I moved to the UK. Yes, JK bad these days, but that Harry Potter vibe of like, ooh, cobblestone streets and old buildings, like it really gives you the vibe that like, if I took a wrong turning down the wrong street, I might just disappear into the Fey realms. And there is even that vibe now of, you go to little country towns where they hold little traditions alive. You'd mentioned about the cloth around the tree. One of the things I researched was showing something called the Saint Bridget's Cross, which is like a woven star that you might hang from your house, doors and windows, which are meant to be like a blessing or a protection. But people still do that, or they might make a doll of Bridget, which I think they pronounce as like a breedog, which gets paraded
Mhm.
around by local girls or straw boys, and it's things like that that are all meant to kind of invoke the energy and the spirit. So even that, little dolls, and you'd mentioned voodooism, and that's a common trope that gets talked about. So again, interesting how these little moments seem to feed through a lot of what we hold and believe today.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like you can't really separate any of the because paganism led to folk tradition, which became ingrained in the culture. And like when you said the thing about wells, think about something even more rudimentary than that. Think about people who live in very isolated communities in rural areas. They are most likely getting their water from a well, and that is their water source. That is their source of life. And you mentioned about the star. If you were to come over here to the United States, the Amish still will hang stars on their barns as a form of protection. So no matter what, it can't be separated. And people look, I'm not going to I'm going to try not to make a blanket statement here about a certain type of a person who believes in a monotheistic worldview, right? But we have all met very hardline conservative people who refuse to see anything outside of what they have been taught their entire life. And they get very, very upset when you start pointing out, well, your traditions are really not that different from mine. And they get mad because it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. But, I'm sorry, a lot of modern religion doesn't actually have a lot to do with Jesus.
And then it's interesting in that aspect when you were speaking about like the Bridget's crosses, because that's also the same time of year that Catholics if I can make like a quick oh God. Wow, the word just flew out of my head. Confession. There we go. Came back online. I grew up Catholic, went to Catholic school, did a whole lot of that. So naturally I turned to paganism after that, but as so many do. Because Catholicism is so closely linked to pagan belief systems, the Bridget's cross and the Palm Sunday cross are two separate straw woven protection symbols that are, well, from what we're saying about Imbolc and what I'm learning today, both created around the same time of year. So there's a lot of cross-cultural, I guess, beliefs that tie in.
You,
It's interesting how these, not coincidences, but how these sort of like mutual practices spawn. And I wonder where it had begun or like where the crossover went.
it's interesting when we not to step away from this conversation entirely, but to point to gaming for a second here, right? Like everything that we do is very individualistic. It is very individual how we approach our diet and whatnot. But just like any other grouping of people, we have culture and this desire for community. And what is going to be at the center of a gaining community when people come together is going to be some semblance of feasting. So I just find it so fascinating that there is this constant step away but call back to, and it all comes around about again. And I think this is something I've always found very interesting about pagan holidays and pagan ideals, is that really no matter how far you might think something stretches away, like the analogy of like the umbilical cord. Like you can step as far away as you want, but there is this invisible tether that holds you to the root of where the thing came from. And I do feel like eventually we might need to have a conversation about ethno-religion and ethno-spirituality, because there is this idea of, divorcing values from faith, and yet for many people it's not just that idea of spirituality is their personal conviction. It is tied to ethnicity, tied to culture and family and rearing and food again, and so many of these moments. um Tim, you look like you want to jump in.
It kind of surprises me that nobody has thrown like a bacchanalia. No one's thrown a Grommr off that's like a, hey, we're gonna have a bacchanalia. Like, talk about the perfect deity to invoke in that. Anyway, Bacchus was all about indulgence. He was a little bit different from Dionysus. Bacchus was a little bit more rowdy, a little bit more kind of like, like let's fucking party, and eat and drink and just like go nuts. I don't know. You'd think that somebody would have thought that up by now.
Did you, speaking to the sort of separation of Bacchus from Dionysus, have you like, you know what? Actually, I'm just going to stop talking about that because I was going to bring it back to Jesus again, because there's like the theory of that Dionysus and Jesus are of a similar mythological bent, both being like reborn gods, son
Yeah,
of.
they have similar origins. Similar origins. They were both born with no. I mean, they were, well. Dionysus obviously is a little bit different because Jesus, Virgin Mary. Dionysus was, his mother was like killed, and then he was taken as like still a fetus and sewn into Zeus's leg, and then he like sprung from Zeus's calf. Like it's weird,
Yeah, and
but
hidden away in a cave so that Hera couldn't finish the job she started in the
yeah,
beginning. Got a little angry
yeah.
about the infidelity, but yeah, interesting. It's just interesting how many similarities there are across cultures. But yeah, a Grommr Bacchanalia should be something that happens. I mean, they just did it at the friggin' Olympics, so it's re-entered the zeitgeist. We should, work on that. It's weird that there's not more of symbolism of that in gainer culture.
I mean, again, that brings up something very interesting. Talking about in bold today, a lot of this is around symbols and around rites of service and uh, and again, I know you said it before, like you can't get away from these things. That Catholic sense, in a way, of ritual and sacrament and all of these things. Yeah, I do wonder sometimes, like, not to think if like gaining as a concept would like benefit from this, like as such a specific thing, but I don't know. I think it would be welcomed, and I think it would be fun, if nothing else, to find an opportunity to do that. Sometimes I feel like what we often come back to with the podcast, like, is yes, gaining horny, but also you fat every other minute of every other day. Uh, Susan, you laugh, but like, do you want to know how many fucking messages like I have gotten, like people being very lovely about the podcast, and they basically say, because gaining turns me on, and I'm truly sat there like, really, that does it? I'm shocked,
Wait, you
shocked.
like fat dudes too? That's so weird. Me too.
This concept has
That's
never been broached in this
crazy.
community. And someone
What?
else recently, he was like, "When are you guys going to talk about the sexy stuff on the pod?" And I'm like, "Everyone else talks about this. We don't need to. Go sub to a Patreon. Fuck."
Like, yeah, there's Patreons, there's OnlyFans, there are many avenues to talk about how fat men make you horny. Now we're talking
100%.
about Christian. Now we're talking about Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus,
Oh.
amen. Although not to call back to me invoking Jesus on this podcast when Preston Brock mentioned chicken smoothies.
Oh,
Chickens. Oh yeah.
oh God. There's like do you know Joel Kim Booster, the
Yes.
comedian? I've seen him on his Instagram do that. It's really,
Oh, Joel, no.
speaking of Jesus, yes, he needs it. Cappy needs it for that fucking cottage cheese stuff. So, which we've spoken of privately, and I guess call him out here too. That's disgusting. Um,
I, I think we're gonna have to add this as like a regular question from season 5. Just casually throw it in as the last question of the episode. Like, are you team cottage cheese or not?
Firmly
I'm not,
not.
I'm neither for or against. I don't eat it, but I don't care if other people do.
Oh,
Yeah.
I don't care if other people do either. I just personally,
Yeah.
your practice is your practice. If you want to be chugging boosts or you want to be choking down cottage cheese, that's your business.
And then we're back to the sacraments of Imbolc. How people choose to celebrate is absolutely their right to do so, and we do not judge that, and we champion that, of course. Um, but as you all have both mentioned, Imbolc is not necessarily something that's like a major holiday or like a major celebration. So I was doing a little bit of Googling to see like who's actually observing the day. Historically, it is Irish and traditional Scottish and Manx people. Manx are the people of the Isle of Man, which is considered a British territory. It's like a little island in between the Great Britain Island and Ireland, so it's the one in the middle there. And then Pagan the Wiccans from all around. Um, but I want to ask, what has surprised you both about Imbolc, either in your practices or your research, or even just in the conversation today?
Something that I always notice about myself is as spring begins to come, I get really twitchy. Like, I don't know if it's cabin fever. I don't know if it's like I just feel that things are waking up again. I always get like really kind of listless. Well, not listless isn't the word. I get very antsy. I get very like, I don't know, I
Restless.
get itchy. I feel like, oh, something's coming. And I know that spring often brings storms with it. So maybe that's just some sort of reaction to that coming on. But I always feel that the energy in spring is fucking weird. Like I feel chaos energy every spring.
Yes, it's very that. And I mean, like, there is just there is just like a weirdness to spring because you're so ready for the weather to turn good and you're so ready to reemerge from like your hovel back out into the world and kind of experience the warmth of the sun on your skin again. And then there's all those false starts that happen. I mean, I'm in a place that gets cold. I do have seasons where I am. You said you're in Ohio?
Yeah,
Yeah, so I would assume similar.
yeah. So we haven't gotten a lot of snow the last couple of winters, honestly. It's only been one or two major snowfalls. But it's everything's dead. The sky is constantly gray. It's always raining. It's always cold. It's just, one of those seasons where you're just fucking miserable. And then like, if we have spring weather by St. Patrick's Day, it usually means that it's going to be an early spring. If we have a shitty St. Patrick's Day, it's not going to get nice until June 1st.
Yeah. New York is similar to in that way. And it's like as soon as you see the trees starting to bud, or as soon as you like get that sense that things are starting to wake back up, you're just like ready to go. Like I don't know, I won't speak for you, but my body's just like as soon as that happens, it's like time, you know.
Yeah.
But you still have realistically 4 to 6 weeks of waiting to do. So that in between, I feel, is where that chaotic energy you were speaking of kind of like manifests more fully.
I must say, like, the conversation around seasons is interesting for me because obviously I'm Antipodean. I've grown up for the majority of my life where my seasons run the opposite. So, middle of the year is wet season, and end of the year is stonking hot. Like, Christmas at 110 degrees is a standard for the majority of my life. So, it is interesting to see this kind of parallel of how seasons pan out, and now living in the UK with seasons on the opposite schedule. Eventually, I think it would be cool if we find some guests who are appropriate to speak on it. I'd love to talk about how, especially in the southwest of Australia, where I'm from, like the Noongar people identify 6 seasons, and I think there are people groups in the east of Australia who do something very similar with like a 6 season cycle. So, if any listeners out there have any form of indigeneity of Australia's history and context and would like to speak on that, please reach out to us at thiccradio@gmail.com. Would love to have an episode to talk about that. But on Imbolc, I want to ask y'all. We were talking like what the gamer community could kind of do with something like. Well, it wasn't so specifically Imbolc. We were talking like paganistic things, Bacchanalia, and things like that. But what do you think gainers could specifically glean from like the values and ideals of a celebration like Imbolc?
Well, if it's a celebration that's meant to kind of set the intention for the upcoming growth season, which I assume like part of it also has to do with just the mundane aspects of having to go about your life, like preparing and growing the food that you're going to consume for that year, and like prepping your fields and whatever for cultivation, like that seems like it's a one-to-one for the gainer community. Like take the time to set your intentions for whatever gains you want to make that year, cook, feast.
If you've got some friends, something as simple as, because these are still cold weeks ahead, invite your friends over. If you got a fireplace, start a fire. If you don't, get one of those like stupid fake fireplace heaters, and sit around and either chew the fat, play games, drink hot cocoa. I mean, something as simple as that is just gathering together in the home is a means of celebrating this holiday. It's supposed to be about warmth and fellowship and connection and all the other stuff that we mentioned. But if you're not one of those people who likes to do any of that, just hang out with your friends.
And you said this is a holiday that specifically kind of centers around Bridget. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, from what I understand of her, she's a triple goddess, and one of her aspects is a hearth goddess.
Yes.
So if you, like you were saying, simply gather with your friends, loved ones, whatever, and you're within the hearth of the modern home, which would be the kitchen, cooking together could be a good activity, not simply eating. I know, like in the gainer community, we have a tendency to focus more on the act of consumption than the act of creation. So getting together and maybe creating the food that you want to eat together in a way, like there is a magic in that. You're setting your intention with your friends, you're creating a community, you're fostering an energy within your home. That seems in keeping with this practice from what little I've learned of it through our conversation today. I mean, we do that many different times during the year.
And if you happen to like cooking and you're interested in this, you can always look into kitchen witchery. That's always an avenue you can go down.
Yeah, sprinkle some cinnamon over an open flame and curse that guy.
Well, no, I mean
that flaky feeder.
Well, kitchen witchery is actually working sort of like spells or ritual work into food, and it's mostly it's not like I'm gonna feed this cursed thing to someone and they're gonna die. Like don't think that that's what it is. It's more about emotion and intention, and like when you make something from the heart and you give it to someone you love, they tend to like it that much more because you put your intention of love into it. That's sort of the basic boards of kitchen witchery.
Once
Yeah,
again,
and
we
that is like something that crosses over cultures. Like I think was it in Korean culture when they're describing sort of a food, like they say like your hand is in this because you used your hand to create it. Like you can taste that sort of thing. There's a lot of power behind that.
mm,
And that like the act of service of creating that food for someone or creating it together even.
100%. Like, again, this comes back to those cross-cultural moments you were just talking about. Like, it's made with love. The secret ingredient is love. Like, that, again, references to shit that has been around for thousands of years. And we talk about this in common parlance and think nothing of it, but it is still very real. And also, the very real thing that, like, Disney's Ratatouille was all about, which was the magic of creating something that like triggers a memory that takes you back to like a moment in your childhood where you have like mother's or grandmother's or auntie's dish, that one special meal that oh, it awakens like all the best memories, all the most positive reflections, and makes you feel that much more sated, that much warmer, that much more like emotional through it. We talked about this on the podcast, right? Like humans have got five senses. One of them is taste, and it's also influenced by scent, but we'll focus on taste. Like one of the five avenues in which we experience the entire cosmos of creation. Like flavor and culture and all of that is such a beautiful way of experiencing the world around you. And what a fabulous way as well that hearth and coming together and cooking together. I was doing some research and they mentioned specific foods that a lot of cultures look at are things like sunflower seeds, walnuts, citrus fruits, including pineapples and pomegranates, mature cheeses, eggs, and other dairy products, cooked tomatoes and asparagus, beans and lentils, salmon, oysters, and cinnamon. Which honestly, like thinking about the different things I would want to make with things like that, I'm just like, oh, makes me hungry just thinking about it. Like a really nice piece of sea bass with like a lemon caper butter moment, just delicious. Ah,
Yeah, definitely. And then what you had something in here about a bread? What is it? Followed by brambrack? Am I saying that right?
um,
Appleback or bramback with tea. It's a yeasty bread with
oh,
raisins and sultanas, which is just a fancy British way of saying raisins.
well, no, because like isn't sultanas are made from grapes and raisins are made from prunes? Is that the one?
No, sultanas are
No.
golden raisins that are turned into like they're white grapes that are turned into raisins, and raisins are just like regular table grapes, like
Okay.
red or
Okay, so they're both the same, ostensibly the same thing with like a slight difference. But you know, sultanas and raisins, tasty, tasty. And I think there's another thing here about sowens, which is a type of porridge, or like dumplings, or bannocks, which is a type of Scottish quick bread. So, but even that notion, like bread and tea, that's a very British Celtic thing to be like, let us sit. Let us have a very simple sup with a very simple beverage and sit by the window and chit chatter. So it definitely gives that vibe of like the energy is beginning to come back. Get yourself together, have a seat, have a moment, prepare, be ready. I mean, it's interesting, Tim. I know you said this is technically closer to Groundhog Day, but in a way, it kind of feels like a lot of the intentions of New Year, in a way that are kind of thrown into.
Yeah, yeah. And that's probably a holdover from, I mean, think about early man was most likely measuring time by the turn of the season. So, you know, a time of the year that Imbolc falls on was probably closer to their new year than anything else.
yeah, we sort of switched away from the natural rhythms of the earth as we've, progressed our like civilizations past the need to be so directly connected to things, which I guess would also be a good practice for gainers or anybody else during this time to kind of like recodify your connection to the world around you. And I mean, there could be maybe like a conversation there between, especially as we were discussing, like cooking together and coming together to create the food that we're consuming, and like the disconnect maybe in like gaming culture between just consumption of calories and like the intention behind the food that you're actually consuming and like what that's doing for you. Like it could be better to slow it down and like actually prep the food and while you're eating it together, you know? I don't know if that makes
Mm. No,
there's like half a thought in there.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. We often come back to this point, which we have to caveat by saying we're not saying that you can't gain unhealthily if you want to gain unhealthily. And also, we're not saying that to gain healthy is bad. I think even like health as a concept is a very like amorphous concept. Like what is healthy to one is not the same to the other. But I think a beautiful thing about what you're expressing there is so much of gaining, because it is an inherently capitalistic notion to say I am taking more than I need to grow myself, right?
Mm,
I
hmm.
think we have to maybe challenge ourselves to give back a little bit. And maybe the giving is, like you were saying, in cooking and preparing food for friends. I have taken this incredible gainer recipe ideal, which is packed with a lot of calories, but you know what? I've decided for flavor, I'm going to throw in XYZ. And maybe as a bit of a heartiness, I've added in these couple of veggies. Or I know you're particularly a fan of things that have a bit of this in it, so I've thrown that in it. And I've created a unique spin, and I'm giving it to, and I've made this meal to specifically share with you, my friend, who I love. And it's a way of recognizing you, your journey of growth, and not necessarily always centering the self. It's an intention to bring other people into the conversation. And so that maybe if you're building that community during the times in the year when you're feeling a bit down, you've got more of a community to lean on in that regard. And what a beautiful thing when someone else is struggling to know that there is such a wonderful way within gaining to give that person some love and support in a way that maybe we haven't typically thought of.
Yeah, like I would hate that. I was about to say like a newer, more radical way of encouraging, but it's really not. It's actually just a return to when we spent more time together in the act of creation instead of consumption.
I would say that if you do candle making as a hobby, this is actually like the perfect holiday to do that because it's also known as Candlemas.
Oh, I've heard that before.
Yeah,
That
that's
makes
Yeah.
like an orthodox, I think.
Yeah, again, it's where the Catholic Church decided to take it and run with it and turn it into something. But like they've done with everything.
yeah.
So yeah, if you enjoy candle making as a hobby, this is the holiday for it.
You know, considering how many deviations to Catholicism and Orthodoxy and Christianity there even are within this type of conversation, much like you were saying before, Susan, you know, it was easy, parroting what you're saying here, to pivot to paganism because there were so many tropes similar to Catholicism, and it was a more free way of expressing yourself. Maybe there's a point here to hone in on, because as queer people, many of us come from some form of religious trauma, especially within these types of religions. So actually, maybe this is a holiday that maybe is worth considering dipping one's toes just a little bit into. Not to say that you have to convert, and not to say you have to do the whole sense of ritual and kitchen sink and all that, but maybe just a little something something, and maybe indulging in some faith practices that are stripped back in a way, maybe would lead to opportunities for a bit of healing and a bit of moving forward with.
It's a good idea. Setting, like being able to set your intention and recenter yourself is always beneficial, you know, just taking that pause to do that, especially like now in today's fast-paced world where we're constantly moving, constantly going. It's good to like disconnect from that for a second and really reevaluate like what your desires are.
Constantly moving, constantly going, constantly growing. This
Hmm.
element within gaining, and I know that many of us who are gainer practitioners know this full well. Gaining is very rarely a linear journey. It is often beset by setbacks and changes and shifts and all the other bits of life that come along. So maybe that's a good opportunity to, much like we've been talking about resetting, setting intentions for gaining, also giving oneself a break and giving oneself the opportunity to say, this is a fresh year or a fresh time for me to reapproach my gainings with a new fervor and to choose to shed any guilt or shame or frustration from the previous year of setbacks, and looking forward to the new year with splendor and the promise of potential rather than the fear of obligation.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good time to kind of like Ooh, that was alchemize maybe. Just like transmute parts of the things that are less satisfactory into a more satisfactory mindset, even.
Y'all, I think this has been a pretty fire episode. This has actually been both fun and enlightening, and also just like, yes, it kind of feels like that gif of like that guy from Always Sunny in Philadelphia when he's got like the red lines, he's like piecing it all together. That feels like me right now, being like, yes, it all makes sense. Wait, listen. Or at least that's the little squirrel that's running around in my mind. But Susan, I want to say thank you for an incredible episode here today. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, marvelous. Now, where can our listeners find you online?
Well, I'm on Instagram as Lazy Susan. Oh God, I have to spell it. It's Laissez Susan.
Fantastic. And for those who can't be bothered, we will simply write it and put it in the show notes. So just like copy paste that or whatever. But that's it for another week here on Thicc Radio, another special here on Thicc Radio. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review. If you liked this episode, the podcast, or just us in general, please share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me on Instagram and BlueSky at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at ThiccyMouse. You can also look us up on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Thicc Radio, or at our website at podpage.com/thiccradio. If you want to submit a voice note or become a financial supporter of the show, you can find the links in the show notes, and you can always write to us at thiccradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Bye, Pat.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Enter app podcast produced by Stan and Thicky Mouse.
Mixed and mastered by stannnum.
Our artwork is provided by Lokitu.
Our theme song is provided by Spotify.